A powerful man's funeral can tell you more than his obituary ever will. Harry Cohn did not need to be loved to run Columbia Pictures. He only needed people afraid enough to obey. That fear built careers, broke enemies, and turned a studio office into a place where stars learned how much power one man could hold. Then he died. 2,000 people came to the funeral, and Hollywood kept repeating the same bitter line. Maybe they were there to make sure he was really gone. But what happens when the man everyone feared is finally unable to answer back? So when the coffin closed, the question was not who mourned Harry Cohn. It was who finally got free. You're watching Hollywood Dark Secrets, where the funeral is only the beginning. Before Columbia Pictures became a studio with awards, stars, and a permanent place in film history, it was a name people laughed at. In the 1920s, the company was called CBC Film Sales. The letters came from Cohn, Brandt, and Cohn. Harry Cohn, his brother Jack Cohn, and Joe Brandt. On paper, it was just another small motion picture business trying to survive in a rough new industry. In Hollywood, it became a punchline. Bigger studios mocked it as corned beef and cabbage. That nickname was not harmless. It was meant to mark the company as cheap, crude, and unworthy of the polished studio world. Harry Cohn heard the joke. He understood exactly what it meant. The men at the larger studios were not only mocking his company, they were mocking him. They saw him as rough. They saw him as loud. They saw him as a man without the right manners, the right education, or the right social polish. Hollywood liked to pretend it was built on dreams, but it had its own class system. Some men entered the business already wearing the right suit. Harry Cohn entered with a chip on his shoulder and no interest in pretending he had been invited. He had left school young. He had worked ordinary jobs. He knew what it felt like to be dismissed before he had spoken. That kind of background can make a man generous toward other outsiders. In Cohn, it did something colder. It taught him that respect was not given. It had to be taken, then guarded with both hands. Every joke about CBC became another mark on a private ledger. Every executive who treated him as beneath them gave him another reason to build something they could not ignore. Columbia's early lot did not look like an empire. It looked like a company fighting to keep its head above water. Budgets were tight. The films were practical. Prestige was scarce. The studio did not have MGM's shine or Paramount's elegance. Columbia had speed, stubbornness, and a man at the top who carried humiliation like fuel. Cohn did not want to win Hollywood's approval by becoming softer. He wanted to win enough power to make the old insult useless. That hunger shaped the studio. Columbia moved like a business that knew it had no cushion. A missed release could hurt. A bad run could matter. Every dollar had to be watched. Every contract had to work. Every actor, writer, and director had to understand that the studio was not a charity. Cohn's defenders would later say that this pressure made Columbia sharp. His enemies would say it made the place cruel. Both could be true. Hard conditions can create discipline. They can also give a ruthless man a permanent excuse. Then came the film nobody expected to change everything. In 1934, Columbia released It Happened One Night. The production did not arrive with the aura of a guaranteed masterpiece. Clark Gable came from MGM under circumstances often described as a kind of punishment. Claudette Colbert was not treating the project like a royal appointment. Frank Capra had talent, instinct, and a sharp feel for human behavior. But Columbia was still Columbia. The elite studios did not expect the old joke to walk into the Academy Awards and take the room. It happened one night, won the 5 major Academy Awards: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, Best Writing. For Columbia, it was a public transformation. The studio that had been called Corned Beef and Cabbage had produced one of the defining films of the decade. The people who laughed now had to say Columbia's name with a different kind of respect. For Harry Cohn, the victory was not only professional, it was personal. He could hold the awards as proof that the men who mocked him had been wrong. But winning did not make him gentle. It made him more certain. If pressure had brought him here, then pressure worked. If humiliation had sharpened him, then maybe humiliation could sharpen everyone under him. If Hollywood only respected force, he would give it force. The Oscar did not heal the old wound, it armed it. Cohn's power grew, but his insecurity did not disappear. That was the dangerous combination. A secure man with power can be difficult. An insecure man with power can turn every meeting into a trial. Cohn wanted results, but he also wanted submission. He wanted people to know they were not dealing with a polite executive. They were dealing with the man who could start a career, stall a career, or make a person spend months waiting for a phone that never rang. At Columbia, a contract was not only a business document, it was a leash. A casting decision was not only a creative choice, it was a reminder of ownership. A meeting with Cohn was not only a meeting, it was a test. The question was not simply whether you could act, write, direct, or produce. The question was whether you understood who controlled the room. The conflict with his brother Jack made that need for control worse. Columbia had power split between Hollywood production and New York finance. Jack Cohn handled important financial operations from New York. Harry Cohn controlled production in Hollywood. In theory, the arrangement could have balanced the company. In practice, it turned family tension into corporate warfare. Jack watched costs. Harry wanted authority. Jack saw risk. Harry heard insult. The distance between New York and Hollywood did not cool the conflict. It made it harder. A budget note could feel like a slap from across the country. A call about expenses could become an accusation. The studio was not only divided by office location, it was divided by temperament. Jack wanted financial control. Harry wanted room to move. Neither man seemed built to surrender easily. By the early 1930s, the struggle became serious enough to threaten Harry's position. Jack and allies on the business side tried to limit or remove him. The exact mechanics of corporate maneuvering can sound dry, but inside the company, the meaning was clear. Harry had been challenged by his own blood. That mattered more than any balance sheet. A stranger's attack could be answered as business. A brother's attack entered the body differently. Harry survived the challenge and strengthened his hold. But victory did not calm him. It deepened the lesson he wanted to believe. If even family could move against him, then trust was a luxury. If a brother could become an opponent, then every employee, actor, writer, agent, and executive had to be watched. Loyalty could not be assumed. It had to be forced into shape. That is how fear became policy. People at Columbia learned to measure their words. A complaint made near the wrong person might travel. A joke in a hallway might return with consequences. A director's private irritation might somehow reach the office. Stories spread that Cohn used informants, hidden listening devices, and sudden interruptions to keep people nervous. Some of those stories have grown through decades of Hollywood retelling, and a responsible script has to admit that not every detail can be proved cleanly. But the atmosphere itself is not hard to understand. Columbia workers believed the boss might hear them. Belief was enough. When people believe the walls are listening, they change. First, they lower their voices. Then they choose safer words. Then they stop saying certain things at all. That is the real value of surveillance, whether mechanical or human. It makes people manage themselves. Cohn did not need to stand in every room. He only needed people to imagine he might appear in the consequences. His office became the physical center of that pressure. Accounts describe it as intimidating, formal, arranged to make the visitor feel small. The large desk, the distance, the waiting. The sense that the man behind the desk had already decided how much space you were allowed to occupy. Hollywood understood staging better than any industry in America, and Cohn used staging in business. A person who stands while the boss sits learns something. A person forced to cross a long room learns something. A person waiting for permission to speak learns something. The room taught obedience before Cohn said a word. Some stories connect Cohn's office style to his admiration for Benito Mussolini. The exact details have been told in different ways, including stories about a signed photograph and a taste for authoritarian display. What matters is not whether every piece of the legend is perfect. What matters is that people found the comparison believable. Cohn's studio rule carried the feel of command. He liked hierarchy made visible. He liked visitors to feel the difference between the man who gave orders and the people who needed favors. Cohn did not need a uniform. The studio gave him enough power. At Columbia, control moved through paperwork, publicity, casting, and the body itself. No example shows that more clearly than Margarita Cancino, the young dancer who became Rita Hayworth. The public later saw Rita as one of the great beauties of the Golden Age, but that beauty was not simply discovered. It was built. It was managed. It was altered until the original woman became harder to find under the finished image. Margarita Cancino carried a name, a face, and a background the studio did not believe it could sell in the way it wanted. Her Spanish heritage, her dark hair, her natural hairline, her public identity, all became business problems. Columbia wanted a star who could move through the American market with less friction. The solution was not to let the audience grow more complex. The solution was to remake the woman. Her name changed. Her hair changed. Her public presentation changed. Accounts describe painful electrolysis treatments used to raise her hairline. Her hair was dyed. Her image was softened, anglicized, and sold. Margarita Cancino became Rita Hayworth, and the transformation made money. That is the brutal part. The machine worked. The erasure was profitable. The audience saw glamour. Columbia saw return on investment. Old Hollywood was skilled at hiding pain inside beauty. A photograph could make a face look effortless. A poster could turn a woman into a promise. The public did not see the appointments, the instructions, the procedures, the pressure, the hours in rooms where a person's natural features were treated as obstacles. The public saw Rita Hayworth. The studio saw a marketable reconstruction. Cohn did not invent the makeover, but under men like him, the makeover became an act of ownership. The studio did not simply help an actress find a screen name. It decided what parts of her were profitable and what parts had to disappear. It took a living person and shaped her into an image, then expected her to be grateful when the image trapped her. Rita Hayworth's later sadness around the gap between her public image and private self became one of the clearest emotional wounds of the studio era. Men went to bed with Gilda and woke up with Rita. The line has been repeated because it cuts cleanly. The role had become a fantasy more powerful than the person. Columbia helped sell that fantasy. Cohn understood its value. Once the image was valuable, the woman behind it became harder for the studio to treat as free. Marriage complicated that control. When Rita married Orson Welles, the relationship was not merely private in the studio's eyes. It affected access, image, and authority. A husband could influence choices. A private life could interrupt a publicity plan. A woman making decisions outside the front office could disturb the clean machinery of ownership. Cohn's anger around Rita's independence, whether told through documented fights or industry memory, fits the larger pattern. He treated stars as assets first. Assets were not supposed to move on their own. The Three Stooges faced a different version of the same logic. Their value was not built from glamour. It was built from timing, impact, repetition, and laughter. Their shorts became a durable part of Columbia's business. Theater owners liked them. Audiences returned to them. Their faces helped sell programs. The men brought real value to the studio. But value did not mean fair treatment. The old story is that Cohn kept them unsure of how much money their shorts made, telling them the market was weak or that the studio was doing them a favor. The exact financial details are difficult to reconstruct perfectly, and Hollywood accounting has always had fog around it. But the pattern is believable because it reflects how studio power worked. Keep the performer uncertain. Keep the numbers controlled. Keep gratitude mixed with fear. If the artist does not know his own worth, he negotiates from a lower floor. The public laughed at the Stooges. Columbia counted the receipts. The two experiences lived in separate rooms. That split is important. Comedy can hide exploitation better than almost anything. If the audience is laughing, it rarely asks what the laugh cost. A slap on screen becomes release. A fall becomes joy. A short film becomes childhood memory. The business behind it becomes invisible. The men who generated that laughter could still be kept on tight contracts, still be made to feel replaceable, still be told they were lucky to work. Harry Cohn understood that artists often need information as much as money. Control the information, and you control the negotiation. Control the negotiation, and you control the person's future. That was not an accident. That was the business. Cohn's reputation with women was darker still. Stories about him have long included crude pressure, private advances, and the private pressure culture that ran through old Hollywood. Some individual anecdotes are hard to prove in the clean language of legal evidence, but the power structure is not hard to prove. Studio bosses controlled roles, contracts, screen tests, publicity, suspension, and access. Young actresses needed work. Men like Cohn controlled work. That imbalance created rooms where a refusal could carry a cost, even if no one said the cost out loud. A young woman might arrive in Los Angeles with a photograph, a dress, and one good recommendation. She might be told she had promise. She might be told to come to an office alone. She might understand quickly that charm was not always charm. A private meeting could be a trap. A compliment could be a demand in disguise. A smile from a powerful man could make the floor feel unsafe. That is what power does when there are no witnesses. Cohn was not the only man who used that kind of power. That makes the story worse, not better. He belonged to an industry that often treated female ambition as something to be taxed privately by powerful men. The studio system made women visible to the public and vulnerable behind closed doors. It sold their faces, managed their bodies, and controlled the stories told about them. It called the finished product glamour. Then Joan Crawford walked into one of those rooms with armor. Crawford was not a newcomer. She had survived enough of Hollywood to know the smell of a setup. She had fame, money, discipline, and a public name strong enough to push back. The famous story of her warning Cohn to behave himself, sometimes repeated with the line about having lunch with his wife and children, has the shape of Hollywood legend. It may have been polished by time, but it survives because it captures a truth about power. Crawford could do what younger women could not. She could make him the one at risk of exposure. That difference matters. The story is satisfying because she refuses to shrink. But it is also disturbing because it shows what protection required. She needed a career already built. She needed a name. She needed enough confidence to threaten embarrassment upward. A young contract player did not have that. A desperate extra did not have that. A woman with rent due and no leverage did not have that. Crawford's defiance was not proof that the system was weak. It was proof that only the heavily armored could fight it openly. Jean Arthur's struggle with Columbia shows another kind of punishment. Arthur was beloved on screen, nervous, bright, funny, intelligent, emotionally immediate. She could make hesitation feel like a form of honesty. She could make comedy feel human instead of mechanical. But behind the films, she battled pressure, anxiety, and deep conflict with the studio system. Cohn had tools for stars who resisted. One of the harshest was suspension. If a contract player refused a role, the studio could suspend pay. Then the suspended time could be added to the end of the contract. The star did not move closer to freedom by resisting. She moved farther away. The paper stretched. The cage lengthened. This was the old studio system at its most efficient. It made disobedience expensive. It turned a refusal into more time owed. It could trap a performer inside a cycle where every act of self-protection became another reason for the studio to hold them longer. Jean Arthur's fights with Columbia were not only personality clashes, they were evidence of a structure designed to punish the word no. Hollywood loved rebellion on screen. It sold rebels to the public. It built stories around brave women and stubborn men. But inside the studio office, rebellion was treated as a production problem. The rebel was expected to report to set, wear the costume, say the line, accept the assignment, and keep the machine running. Beyond Columbia's gates, Hollywood also touched the rougher side of American power. The movie business did not float above corruption. It was connected to labor conflict, political pressure, backroom deals, fixers, and men who knew how to make problems disappear from public view. Cohn had associations with underworld figures, including Johnny Roselli. Accounts differ on how deep every relationship went. Some stories are better documented than others, but the broader reality is clear. In old Hollywood, studios and organized crime sometimes moved close enough to make workers nervous. Labor battles were part of that world. Studio workers wanted better wages, safer conditions, and stronger protection. Executives wanted control over costs and schedules. In that pressure zone, labor racketeers like Willie Beoff became part of Hollywood's darker history. The public saw premieres and fan magazines. Behind the scenes, men argued over who controlled the workers who built the dream. That matters because Cohn's power was never just a temper. A temper can frighten a room. A system can frighten a town. Cohn had a system around him. Lawyers, contracts, publicity departments, gossip channels, financial pressure, internal informants, security, industry alliances, and a culture that rewarded results. A bully with no machinery is unpleasant. A bully with a studio becomes an operating principle. The Kim Novak and Sammy Davis Jr. story sits at the meeting point of race, money, romance, and studio control. By the late 1950s, Kim Novak was one of Columbia's most valuable stars. Cohn had invested heavily in her image. She was promoted, shaped, photographed, and sold as a major screen beauty. Sammy Davis Jr. was one of the most gifted entertainers in America, a singer, dancer, comedian, and stage presence with astonishing discipline. He was also a black man, moving through a deeply segregated country that could applaud him on stage and still punish him off stage. Their reported romance threatened more than studio gossip. It challenged the racial boundaries Hollywood believed its market required. A white contracted actress and a black entertainer in a public relationship could trigger backlash from theater owners, newspapers, conservative audiences, and especially the segregated South. Studio executives called that kind of thing a commercial problem. Under the clean phrase sat racism and ownership. Accounts of what happened vary, but the core story has been repeated in biographies, documentaries, and Hollywood reporting. Cohn was furious. Pressure came down. Mob-connected names appear in several versions of the story. Davis was reportedly warned to end the relationship in terms meant to terrify him. Some accounts described threats against his body and career. A responsible script should not pretend every detail is courtroom certified. The story travels through memory, fear, and Hollywood legend. But even the careful version is devastating. Powerful people moved to stop a private relationship because it threatened a studio asset and crossed a racial line. Not long after, Sammy Davis Jr. married Lorraine White. The marriage has often been described as a response to the pressure surrounding Novak. It did not look like romance. It looked like a public signal, a document, a way to prove the dangerous relationship had ended. In that moment, a wedding certificate became a shield. That is one of the coldest details in the story. The machine did not only control roles, it could reach into love. It could decide which relationships were tolerable and which had to be broken before they damaged the product. It could turn a private bond into a public liability and then force a human being to perform compliance for the press. Davis knew humiliation long before that moment. He had lived through racial insult, exclusion, and physical danger. He had built a career with impossible talent and brutal discipline. But celebrity did not erase the rules. It only made his violations of those rules more visible. The message behind the Novak affair was not subtle. Talent did not free him. Fame did not free him. If he crossed the wrong line, the system could still close around him. What made the Novak and Davis affair so cruel was not only the threat itself. It was the lesson built into the threat. Every person watching from the edges of Hollywood understood what had happened without needing a signed confession. A romance had been treated like a studio emergency. A woman's private life had been treated like damaged inventory. A black entertainer's body had been treated like a pressure point. The message traveled faster than any official memo. Do not cross the market. Do not embarrass the studio. Do not make powerful men explain your humanity to people who only care about ticket sales. For Kim Novak, the cost was quieter, but still real. She was not allowed to simply be a young woman making a private choice. Her image had been built by Columbia, and that meant Columbia believed it had the right to manage the meaning of her body in public. A dinner, a photograph, a rumor, a relationship, all of it could be pulled into the studio's financial panic. The studio had sold her as a controlled fantasy, and that fantasy was not supposed to make choices of its own. She later spoke about the pressure and control she felt inside the industry. That pressure did not always arrive as a shouted order. Sometimes it arrived as a smiling executive, a changed schedule, a warning from someone who said they were only trying to help. For Sammy Davis Jr., the wound cut in another direction. He had spent his life proving himself in rooms that were already prepared to underestimate him. He could sing, dance, joke, act, and hold a stage with almost impossible force. But in the Novak scandal, talent did not matter enough. Fame did not matter enough. Money did not matter enough. The men around the machine saw a black man crossing a line they had decided he had no right to cross. That was the real insult. Not that he had done something wrong, but that he had forgotten, in their eyes, where they expected him to stand. That kind of warning does not end when the meeting ends. It follows a person into hotel rooms, dressing rooms, stages, restaurants, and cars. It changes how they read a glance. It changes how they hear a phone ring. It teaches them that applause can disappear the moment power feels offended. Davis remained a giant performer, but the story around Novak became one of those private humiliations Hollywood preferred to turn into legend, because legend is easier to consume than shame. And Cohn's genius, if that is the word, was knowing how rarely the public would ask the deeper question. The audience might hear about a scandal and think only about romance. The gossip press might frame it as forbidden attraction. The studio could deny, redirect, or let the story dissolve into rumor. But underneath the noise was a brutal business calculation. A white female star had a market value. A black male entertainer had a restricted social position. A studio head saw danger in the space between them and moved to close it. That was not romance management. That was racial control enforced through Hollywood economics. This is where Cohn's story stops being only a portrait of one vicious man and becomes a map of the studio era. His cruelty worked because the culture around him already gave it tools. Contracts gave him paper control. Gossip gave him public control. Racism gave him market control. Fear gave him private control. The people around him did not have to agree with every order to benefit from the system those orders protected. They only had to stay quiet long enough for the next picture to open. By the end of the 1950s, the old machinery was beginning to show cracks. Television had changed audience habits. Antitrust pressure had weakened the old studio theater grip. Stars were beginning to understand that independence could be worth more than obedience. The contract system that had once made studio heads feel like kings was no longer as solid as it had been. But Harry Cohn still moved as if the old rules belonged to him personally. He had built his power inside a world of locked gates, long contracts, and frightened workers. He did not know how to rule gently because gentleness had never been his method. So when the final pressure came for him, it did not come from a rival studio, a rebellious star, or a gossip columnist. It came from inside his own chest. That was the one place no contract could reach. No lawyer could extend the deadline. No publicist could rewrite the report. No underworld friend could intimidate the body into obedience. For decades, Harry Cohn had made other people feel trapped inside systems he controlled. Then his own body became the room he could not leave. Harry Cohn died not long after, in February 1958. His heart stopped, and with it stopped one of the most feared voices in Hollywood. The man who had made people wait outside his office, stand before his desk, accept his judgment, and measure every word around him could no longer call anyone in. His body was still. The studio was not. Then came the funeral. 2,000 people attended. That number became part of the legend because it said more than a polite obituary could. A huge funeral can mean love. It can mean respect. It can mean obligation. It can mean fear that has not yet learned the man is gone. Hollywood was built on appearances, and funerals were appearances too. People knew which services mattered. They knew which absences would be noticed. They knew that power did not stop being power the moment a man entered a coffin. The line that survived the funeral was sharper than grief. One famous version, often connected to Red Skelton, said that the crowd proved Harry always gave the public what it wanted. A harsher version carried the idea that people came to make sure he was really gone. The exact wording has shifted through Hollywood lore, but the meaning stayed clear. People were not simply mourning. They were measuring the end of a reign. A loved man and a feared man can both draw a crowd. The silence around them sounds different. The obituaries could call Cohn a pioneer, and they were not wrong. Columbia rose under him. It Happened One Night changed the studio's status. Columbia won awards. Major stars worked there. Important films came out of the system he ruled. He had instincts. He had taste when taste served the business. He knew how to sell. He knew how to push. He built something real. That is why the story is uncomfortable. Cruel men are often useful to the institutions that protect them. If they were not useful, they would be removed more quickly. Cohn delivered films, prestige, profits, stars, discipline, and fear. For the business, the fear was not a scandal as long as the product moved. That was the bargain. The public kept the movies. The studio kept the money. The people inside the machine kept the memory of what it cost. What Hollywood protected was not always the person. More often it was the product, the profit, and the illusion the public had paid to believe. Look at what the official memory prefers. It happened one night. Frank Capra, Rita Hayworth on the poster. The Three Stooges making theaters laugh. Kim Novak glowing under studio lights. Columbia rising from ridicule to power. All of that is real. But it is not the whole record. The missing record sits behind it. Margarita Cancino being reshaped until her original identity was harder to see. Comedians kept uncertain about their own value. Actresses learning which rooms were dangerous. Jean Arthur fighting a contract that could stretch with every refusal. Sammy Davis Jr. discovering that love could become a business emergency. Employees lowering their voices because they did not know who was listening. The screen keeps the finished image. The body remembers the process. Harry Cohn's story is not just about one cruel executive. That version is too convenient. It lets the audience place all the ugliness inside one man and bury it with him. The better question is why the system worked so well around him. Why did so many people tolerate his methods? Why did contracts allow such control? Why did publicity departments polish the results? Why did fan magazines prefer glamour to injury? Why did stars have to become powerful before they could safely say no? Why did the industry keep rewarding men who made fear profitable? The answer is simple and ugly. The machine rewards control. Cohn controlled identity, labor, information, and private lives whenever those lives threatened the studio's money. He understood that a star was not only a performer. A star was a market object, a press object, a fantasy object, and a financial risk. If the person inside the star interfered with the product, Cohn moved against the person. He understood weakness. The weakness of a young actress who needed one role. The weakness of a comedian who did not know the true numbers. The weakness of a star whose contract could be extended. The weakness of a black entertainer facing a racist marketplace. The weakness of a writer who needed the next assignment. The weakness of a crew member who needed the next paycheck. He found the pressure point and pressed. He also understood his own weakness, even if he would never have called it that. He had been mocked. He had been treated as rough, cheap, and unworthy. Instead of letting that experience make him more humane, he made everyone else pay for it. He turned humiliation into management. He turned insecurity into surveillance. He turned the need for respect into a demand for obedience. That is why the funeral matters. It was not only a farewell. It was a release of pressure. People could finally repeat jokes that would have been dangerous in another tone while he lived. They could smile carefully. They could remember privately. They could measure the distance between respect and relief. The man was gone, but the habits he trained into people remained. Fear does not disappear just because the feared person stops breathing. It stays in the body. It stays in the hand that hesitates before dialing a number. It stays in the worker who still lowers his voice in the hallway. It stays in the actress who learns to laugh off danger because naming it could cost too much. It stays in the contract language that outlives the boss. After Cohn, Hollywood changed. The old studio system weakened. Court decisions, television, independent production, shifting audiences, and changing star power made the old mogul model less absolute. But the instinct behind Cohn did not vanish. It adapted. A modern executive does not need a throne-like office to frighten people. A spreadsheet can do it. A quiet phone call can do it. A leak can do it. A risk label can do it. A whisper that someone is difficult can do it. A public image can still become more valuable than the person underneath. The cage changed materials. It did not disappear. That is why Harry Cohn's case still matters. Not every wild story about him should be repeated as fact. Not every piece of Hollywood lore is clean evidence. But the central pattern is strong. Fear, control, image-making, contract pressure, racial panic, gendered entitlement, and the protection of profit over people. Those were not small flaws attached to a big career. They were part of how the career worked. Before this case closes, look at Columbia without the logo. Look at the young women waiting outside offices, wondering whether opportunity always comes with a hidden price. Look at the accountants and ledgers that performers were not allowed to understand. Look at hair falling onto a salon floor as Margarita becomes Rita. Look at Jean Arthur reading another script she does not want while the contract clock waits to punish her. Look at Sammy Davis Jr. being forced to understand that his fame could not protect him from a racial line drawn by men guarding money. Look at 2,000 people at a funeral, all standing close enough to the truth to know why the joke landed. That was not just leadership. That was domination. Harry Cohn did not need to be loved. He proved that. He needed people to obey. For decades, many did. Stars obeyed. Workers whispered. Publicists cleaned. Reporters softened. Rivals watched. The audience bought tickets. And as long as the pictures sold, Hollywood tolerated the cost. The official obituary can tell you he built Columbia Pictures. The darker record tells you what that building required. It required names changed, bodies altered, contracts stretched, rumors managed, romances broken, and people trained to call fear professionalism. Cohn's talent and his cruelty cannot be separated cleanly because the industry rewarded both when they produced results. So when the coffin closed, the question was never only who mourned Harry Cohn. The question was who walked away feeling air enter their lungs for the first time in years. Who stopped waiting for the phone to ring. Who looked at the Columbia gates and wondered if the lock had loosened. Who knew the man was gone, but the method was still alive. Hollywood did not bury the machine with Harry Cohn. It kept the useful parts. It polished them. It renamed them. It made them harder to see. The machine never needed its tyrants to be loved. It only needed them to deliver. Subscribe to Hollywood Dark Secrets, because the next case opens another locked door in the same old building. The names change. The contracts change. The cameras get smaller. But the question stays the same. When the public is buying the dream, who is paying the human cost behind it? Do not just watch the movie, watch the machine.